Hey everyone, we're happy you could join us for today's session, Deep Hacking Appium for Fun and Profit, with R&D Director Daniel Puterman. A quick intro to our speaker. Daniel is R&D Director at Applitools. He's a veteran programmer and team lead and has experience in wide variety of fields, from temperature loggers and web applications to location-based mobile applications and image processing. Daniel is also the organizer of PyCon Israel. So I think we'll let him take the stage now. Daniel, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Adi. I hope everyone can hear me okay. All right, so this webinar is based on a lecture I gave at the recent Appium Conf. It will be similar, but since we're doing a webinar this time, I'll have a chance to go into more details than the original lecture, which I'm guessing would also be published pretty soon. So those of you who aren't familiar with us yet, Applitools is basically doing automatic UI validation, visual validation. And as part of that, we have various SDKs for different automation frameworks. Selenium is, of course, one of the most common ones. And another one is Appium. And this is basically the reason we started actually working with Appium throughout the way. And the reason that we needed to add capabilities to Appium, which is what this webinar is about. All right, so let's move on. What's the plan? Well, we'll start from the bottom line. I'll show you a demo of the end result of the code that we've added to Appium. After that, we'll go over a case study. We've made a very complex pull request to Appium, which included several repositories and multiple capabilities. We'll focus on just a couple of them, so not to waste your time. And at the end, there will be a session of conclusions about what we've learned through the process, and if you want to contribute to Appium, things you should pay attention to. All right, so the demo. Let's go over to the code. Okay, I hope everyone can see my code. This, for those of you who aren't that much familiar with Appium, this is a standard Appium test code. It doesn't have anything to do with Applitools. It's basically starting an Android driver, which means an Android automation, and loads some application to the Android emulator, and then we can start doing the automation. The next part, this part, is the Applitools part. This is standard Applitools code, which means that for you as a user, it doesn't really matter that you're working with Appium. You would get the same capabilities that you would have, for example, with Selenium. The code itself, the core of the code, is an open command, which starts a test at Applitools, the check window command, which is what we actually care about in this webinar, and the close command, which just ends the test. All right, so what did we want to achieve? So this is an example of a standard web page that we use for testing from time to time. And as an example, you can see we have a div with an overflowing content. What Applitools SDKs can provide, it can basically provide you the entire content of an overflowing element as a single picture. So if we go to the Applitools dashboard, for example, you can see the result of a check window command on that element. You get the entire picture. This works very well for web, because Selenium has capabilities that enable us to scroll, for example, inside a scrollable content or to get the location of an element. But there were quite a few things missing when it comes down to working with mobile, specifically when we wanted to get, for example, full-page screenshots using Appium. So coming back to our demo, this command should provide us the full-page screenshot of a test application. You'll forgive me that I'm jumping around between different applications, but just so you can see, this is a basic scroll view application that we use for testing. It's good for us for testing because we can actually see whether or not we're doing the full content stitching correctly. And what you can notice is, for example, if I scroll down, the status bar here at the top and the soft buttons at the bottom are always visible. So, for example, if I would scroll around and take a screenshot for each scroll in order to stitch the content together, I would get repetitions of the status bar at the top and the soft buttons at the bottom. This is, for example, one of the capabilities that we've added to Appium was removing this part from the picture as well as the soft buttons. All right, so let's go to the demo itself. What we're going to do is basically we're just going to run this code. Sorry about that. I'm going to run this code. And what you're going to see is basically Appium starting up the application, the test application, and scrolling it. Basically, the first step is getting it to the top and then starting to scroll down to the bottom in order to get the entire content. This is all of this is available just by the check window command, which was eventually what we wanted to get then after we finish, we scroll back up so that the user can continue from wherever he or she was when the test was started. So going back to the test, basically we're done. And if I look at the result, then you can see a full page. Sorry, let's see it clearly. You can see a full page, what I call a full page screenshot. It's basically a screenshot of the entire content. With this screenshot, we actually wanted to keep the status bar on top, but just on top. We didn't want any repetitions going around. And you can see that this is indeed the case. When we scroll down the content, there's no repetition and there's no soft buttons at the bottom. So this was our goal when we started adding code to Appium. This is the end result that we wanted. And the capabilities, by the way, are available from the last couple of days in Appium from release 1.8. We still need to release the SDK side of the Applitools part, which will probably be at the middle of next week. But once this is released, then all you have to do to get an entire content of a native application, what you just saw was a standard scroll view, it wasn't web or of any kind, it's just a check window command with full page screenshot enabled, and this is it. And the Applitools SDK would do everything for you. All right. So now that we have this, we can actually move on to what we did. So the idea is to go over all the different parts of adding a feature to Applitools. So theoretically, when you're done with this webinar, you would have a pretty good grasp of one, the structure of Appium, of Appium's repositories, and the steps needed in order to make a pull request, which includes complex capabilities. All right, so full page screenshot is what we call it. It's an entire content screenshot. It's what you just saw. This was our main goal. And the way that we did it was not by adding a full page screenshot to Appium, because it's complex and it depends on many things, but adding several capabilities, Selenium-like capabilities to Appium that will enable us on our SDK side to do the scrolling and stitching and getting the full page screenshot. So one of them, for example, was getting the true viewport screenshot, which means no status bar or soft buttons. The other was deterministic scrolling, which was something that was missing for us. The tap, sorry, not the tap, the swipe or swipe method, for example, wasn't deterministic, which means that if you did swipe with the same values multiple times, you wouldn't move the same amount of pixels. You would end up in different locations. And this made it very complex, for example, to compose a screenshot. So we also treated the deterministic scrolling part and several other capabilities, which I'll show you along the way. We'll focus mostly on the viewport screenshot, but not just that. We'll focus on several other things as well. Okay, so the main problem that we had originally when we wanted to add code to Appium was actually understanding where do we start, because Appium is not a single repository. It's an app. It has a desktop type of app and it has an NPM type of install, but it's basically a composition of various utilities and components that together make up the Appium project. So the first thing that you want to do if you want to start adding capabilities to Appium is talking to these people. These, of course, as an example, these are the two of the main core contributors to Appium. This is Isaac Murchie and Jonathan Lips. Both of them are very cooperative, and of course, we owe them a thank you for all their help with us adding the capabilities to Appium, but any contributor to Appium could probably help you. There's a great community, and there's a lot of responsiveness if you ask questions in the repository or directly. Okay, so this is a diagram showing the internal, let's say, flow of commands within Appium. For iOS, this diagram is a bit outdated. It was true until Xcode 8 because it was based on UI automation. Xcode 7 added XUI tests, and eventually Apple announced they would deprecate UI automation, so Appium now also supports XUI test type of automation. We'll get to that later. For Android, the pattern is still the same, though device and automation engine for Espresso is being developed as well. The basic idea is that Appium is a server which stands in the middle between your Selenium type of commands and the actual device. It receives, you send in commands which are very similar or somewhat identical to standard Selenium commands, and in turn Appium translates these to the most appropriate commands on the device itself. With Android, this is done by actually loading a server jar into the device, which listens to the commands and performs the whichever action you want to do, which is, let's say, it's the easier way to go. With iOS, with UI automation, it was a little different. Basically, UI automation is based on JavaScript. So the code that ran on the device was something that just read JavaScript from the command line, kind of, and executed that on the device. It wasn't an actual server which could perform complex commands similar to Android. With XUI test, this part is no longer true. What happens is that Appium communicates directly with the device through WebDriver agent, which is a project we'll also just give a brief overview of. Okay, so the repositories that of interest for us were, after we've done our research, was the Appium BaseDriver, which is, as its name suggests, performs the functionality of being the parent driver for all other driver implementations. So it's XUI test or iOS driver or UI Automator 2 driver, and Appium support, which is basically a repository for, let's say, common utilities to be used by the different Appium repositories. The driver implementations themselves, which is the XUI test driver. This is the new iOS driver. The iOS driver was the UI automation part. UI Automator 2 is the automation framework for Android. Like I said, Espresso is also being developed, but I'm not sure what its current status is. And on the device side, we have UI Automator. I'm sorry, this is a mistake. It should be UI Automator 2 server, not UI Automator 2 driver. All right. So Appium BaseDriver. This is the first, probably the first thing that you want to take a look at when you start implementing a capability in Appium. Like I said, it's the parent class for all the different drivers. Let's say the main file for the base driver is the driver.js file, obviously. By the way, I have not mentioned it yet, but Appium is written almost entirely in JavaScript. There are parts which run not on the Appium server itself. For example, parts which run on the device, which are written sometimes using the whichever native language is used by the device. So the driver.js is the main file which contains the basic, let's say, the common driver implementation for all other drivers to use. You have a set of common commands that are defined under the commands folder, and you have helpers. Some of these are utilities, but these are utilities which are used specifically on the base driver. If you have utility methods that are common to more than that, then they would probably be in Appium support, as we'll see soon. And one of the most important parts that you have is the routes.js file. Okay, so let's just pop out of the presentation for a moment and take a look at the actual code on GitHub. So first of all, this is the Appium repository on GitHub. I'm pretty sure we'll also provide links to all the repositories that I'm showing right now. So if you want to, keep them or anything like that, they would be in the email. As you can see, these are, sorry, I have a filter here, but Appium has quite a few repositories, which is why I said we should, when we started, we actually had to talk with the Appium community to understand where exactly do we start. This is the Appium BaseDriver repository, which we discussed before. Basically, everything I said is written here, that it's the parent class for all Appium drivers. There's an additional set of explanations, but let's take a look, for example, at the driver.js file. So driver.js, as we mentioned, this is the basically contains the base class for all driver implementations, so Android or iOS, etc. Anything that you would expect from a base class is here. This is the constructor. You have, for example, the create session. Oh, okay. So there was a contribution to create session. Execute command. This is generally the prototype for executing any driver command kind of passes through this this method. Other interesting stuff inside. I think this is basically the most interesting parts in the driver.js part. If we go back and go to the commands part, which is the implementation of actual device commands, let's take a look, for example, on session. So you see you have the create session part here. This is where the actual, when you start a session with Appium, this is where you go through. So this is an interesting part. Get session, when you're working with remote WebDriver and calling get session details, you're getting to this method, for example, and more and more. Other interesting files here are find. So all the find element type of commands, if you're familiar with Selenium, their prototypes are basically here. They're of course implemented by each and every specific driver, for example, the UI Automator 2 or the XUI test driver. Okay, and so let's go back. So Route.js. This is probably the most critical point in your journey to adding any capability to Appium, because it defines the API endpoint where your command will be executed, which means that if you want to do anything, you would go through Routes.js. So there are, I wrote 2.5 possible ways of integration, because you can either create a completely new endpoint, which is something that's, I would say, rarely done. When we started, we had several different endpoints, several different capabilities, which we originally thought would be endpoints, but since Selenium is a W3C standard, then you don't want to change existing commands which are already defined in the standard, and the mobile JSON wire protocol is also pretty well defined, so you're not going to change that either. So most likely you would either add data to an existing endpoint, which is what we did, for example, with the session details part, which now sends us, I will show you that soon, but which now provides, for example, the device pixel ratio and the status bar height. Or you would add capabilities, let's say temporarily, via the mobile prefix of the execute command. So just in case you're not familiar with it, the execute command is basically, let's go over to the code just so I can show you what I mean. The execute command is defined in the Selenium standard. It basically receives some JavaScript usually, But Appium has several, let's say, hook points, which you can define. So if you start your command with, that's more of a, let's say, a de facto standard than an actual written standard, but additional capabilities in Appium are usually added by doing driver.execute and then adding mobile prefix and then the command you want. So if we want, for example, a screenshot without the top status bar or soft buttons, then we added something which looks pretty much like this. This is the command that we eventually execute on Appium to get screenshots the way I showed you before. Okay, so let's go back to Appium. So this is the routes.js file. We can actually take a look directly in it. So, whoops, sorry. So the routes.js file, if I'm not mistaken, is in proxy. Sorry about that. Inside protocol, you have the routes. And you can see the structure is pretty simple. So you have the way that the endpoint is going to look like, where obviously session ID will be replaced by the actual session ID in Appium, etc. And whether or not this is a get or post command or both. And for each one of them, what type of parameters do they get, or what command, actual command, are they execute? So each such endpoint basically eventually translates to something in here, right? Here, not only in the BaseDriver, but obviously in the actual implementations. All right, so moving on, routes.js, important part. BaseDriver commands, I already show you that. I didn't show you the index.js file. It's basically the entry point for all the commands. And as you can see, the implementation is pretty simple. It basically grabs all that commands file and kind of unifies them all into a single object structure. This is an example of a command which you've already seen, get session, and which returns the capabilities, in this case for the session. We actually updated this. We'll go through that soon. All right, so true viewport, this is the capability that we wanted to add. We kind of already discussed this. No status bar, no soft buttons. What's written here is basically what I've mentioned before, but it's maybe important to reiterate that. We started thinking that we're going to add an endpoint to Appium, but after a lot of discussions, we've ended up adding the viewport screenshot via driver execute. And you can actually, I actually have, this is an example of pull request that we've made. I'm just scrolling. We'll ignore the code for now, but you can see that there's a lot of kind of back and forth with the Appium maintainers. They had comments regarding the actual code or how it, or the actual flow, which is a good thing, right? You want to eventually you want to contribute to Appium the way that Appium is built. You want to be part of Appium with the same coding style or linting or anything like that. So this is another example, I think. So, sorry, I'm looking at the files, but we can take a look at the discussion. The point is that you start with an idea, and then you should be prepared to do several iterations until you get the, let's say, the correct way of adding things to Appium. Not just because the Appium team doesn't want you to add things, of course, but because you kind of have, you're thinking out loud with them when you do a pull request to Appium. Okay, so this is a specific explanation for the mobile prefix. This is actually code which is part of the repositories. I showed that in the Appium Conf lecture, but we can go directly to the source now that we're doing a webinar. So we'll go to Appium support in a minute. But for example, this is the UI Automator driver. This is the driver implementation for Android, which is the part that actually sits inside Appium. There's also UI Automator 2 server, which is the part sitting on sitting inside the device. But the point is that if you go to the actual source, if you go to commands, then you would see you have, I think you have, let's see. Right, so execute, let's see, sorry, just go over the, okay, so execute mobile is actually the function being called when mobile prefix is already found. What I want to show you guys is the actual driver.execute command. So it actually might be inside driver. Let's see, execute. Sorry, let me just check for that. Driver UI editor, maybe general. So this is where we've been. All right, so I don't remember the exact location of the execute command, but let's try one more thing, just because I want to, I think it's important to see. So in the code, nope, it's not here. So it's probably, so this means basically that since I can't find it here, that the implementation is actually inside the BaseDriver, right? So I'll go back. Yeah, so this means that the implementation is, since we can't find a specific implementation, then the implementation obviously is in the base class, which is the Appium BaseDriver. But we can actually take a look at the execute mobile part just for a moment and see that all of these are basically command mapping. So you have a mobile prefix and then some other command which needs to be executed, which is basically what I showed. Sorry, which is basically what I showed here. So something like this basically maps to a command here. And if we'll take a look at the UI Automator 2 driver, once again, you'll see that we have a get viewport screenshot command, which actually gets executed. This translates from the mobile execute command to the actual command inside the commands folder. And this is true to any of the driver implementations. So we've just taken a look at Android, but let's take a look at iOS, for example. Okay, so this is XCUI test driver. This is the new iOS driver. It's available, I think, from Xcode 8. And you can see that we have also here we have a get screenshot command, and we also have a get viewport screenshot command, which is the command that we've implemented without the status bar and without in iPhone you don't have soft buttons, but status bar is still an issue. Okay, so we've discussed the mobile execute part and the actual commands it translates to. UI Automator to server, just so you can see when I say something that runs on the actual device. So UI Automator to server, contrary to the rest of the Applitools, the Appium part, is written in Java mostly. You can see there's Gradle here, and this is a standard Java structure. Again, it contains a lot of things being implemented on the device. Mostly it contains the actual server listening to commands coming from Appium, but it also contains the various commands, the actual commands that you want to execute. So if we'll take a look at this is the pull request that we've sent to Appium. For example, one of the commands that we added was content size, which grabs basically the size of the entire size, let's say, of a scrollable element, and not just the viewport part of it. This is what basically lets us know how much scrolling needs to be done in order to get the entire content of an element. And this must be run on the device. For iOS, the method is a bit different. All right. So, okay, this is what we've discussed. The device side of things. This is an example. I showed you one just now, but this is another one. This is the get device pixel ratio. We need the device pixel ratio because some devices return inflated images, right? If you have, let's say, a device with a device pixel ratio of 2, this means that even though, for example, its logical size is, I don't know, 600 over 800 or something like that, then the actual image you're going to receive would be 1200 over 1600. So you have to make sure to do coordinate adjustment in order to, for example, get the correct regions of a screenshot, or do correct stitching to know where the actual position is. So this is another capability which we've added to Appium. Okay, so this is basically a summary of everything I showed you. There's not much to go over it. What I do want to show you maybe is, for example, how we get the device pixel ratio. So, for example, the device pixel ratio we get as part of the session details. So let's say we go to UI Automator, and we go to the driver part, and we say, okay, I want to get the session part. Okay, so get session basically returns all the information about the session, but what's important here is that it calls this method, fill device details. Sorry. This method is being called as part of the create session part. When a session is created, then all those details are gathered, and then they're being added to the capabilities. And what happens is that we call get session. This method adds all the relevant information of the session specific to the Android part, but it also calls the base classes get session, which means the Appium BaseDriver get session. We're in the driver.js file again in Appium BaseDriver, and get session. Sorry, this is get session, as we've seen before, is actually, this is actually something, for example, that you need to do a little investigation, but the get session is implemented in Android, is implemented in driver.js, and in the BaseDriver it's implemented as a separate command. But we'll go to get session, and as you can see, basically get session returns the capabilities. But if you pay attention, then as we said, the data that we need is being added to the capabilities inside the Android implementation of the driver. This is how we get this data back. Okay, let's see what we have left. So we've actually gone into, we basically covered most of what I wanted to show you. These are conclusions. So adding capabilities to Appium is not impossible. When we started, it took us almost a year to eventually get all the capabilities that we wanted to Appium. But this included, first of all, some research as to how Appium is structured, because we haven't worked with Appium before. And even after we understood it, we had to find first of all, we had to find the ways to add the capabilities themselves, and then we had to find the correct way to add them to Appium, which is all the interaction with the maintainers and the pull requests, which is also a process that takes time, but it's a good process. I mean, it's not something that you want to ignore. Large contributions can take a while, but small contributions, as Isaac mentioned in Appium Conf, are also very welcome to Appium and are usually easier to get merged. Appium itself has a very active community and maintainer team, so you would most likely find answers to your questions if you have any. Another kind of tip, which is kind of trivial, but you need to pay attention to, is that eventually Appium is just a bridge to the specific device, which means that at the bottom line, in order to add some new capability for a specific type of OS, you need to be familiar with that specific OS. So, for example, on our side, we had someone which is an Android expert and someone who is an iOS expert, in order to add the different capabilities, because these are completely different frameworks. And in addition to that, you need to add the actual bridge code, which is what goes into Appium eventually. So this is it. This basically covers everything I wanted to show you. So now, if you have specific questions, we can take them. Adi, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I will. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Oh, okay, perfect. So yeah, we do have a few questions. I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions now, would be the time. So questions panel, ping away, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Okay, so first question, why is Appium able to identify elements which are not visible but part of the current page in iOS but not in Android?
Okay, so I honestly can't say I know for sure, but I can tell you what the answer is based on. The reason is because, as I mentioned, Appium is just a bridge. So whatever Appium can do in iOS is based on the APIs provided by the automation framework for iOS, for XUI, for example. So if there's something that can be done in iOS but cannot be done in Android, it's most likely because the underlying automation framework doesn't give you that option. There's a chance that it's just not implemented, but I'm guessing that the first answer is the correct one, that the underlying automation framework doesn't give you the ability to do that. So probably UI Automator doesn't give you the ability to do that. Okay.
Okay. Next question. Is mobile viewport screenshot available online, and is it available in JavaScript or Java?
Okay. So it's available online as part of the Appium 1.8 release. If you're using the Applitools SDK, then Applitools will just grab the viewport screenshot for you. You don't have to specifically ask for the viewport screenshot. This is basically what we ask as a default. Okay, and let me just reiterate, if you're working directly with the Appium API, then you don't care if then it can be either JavaScript or Java, because you're basically sending REST commands. So you can take the Selenium JS bindings or the Selenium Java bindings, either would work. If you're working with the Applitools SDK, then Java would be available probably middle of next week. And I'm guessing JS would come very shortly after. Couple of weeks after, then JS will also provide that support. Okay. So I see that there are quite a few questions which are why Appium, for example, why Appium doesn't support the adb-r install command to update an app. So I cannot answer that honestly, because we are not part of the Appium team. Applitools, even though the name has some similarities, maybe I should have kind of emphasized that before. Applitools is a company that has, it doesn't have nothing to do with Appium because we contributed code, but we do something completely different. So I cannot speak for Appium. This is a question which is, these types of questions are most likely should appear in the Appium repository, the Appium issues, like, or you can contact the people I mentioned, for example, and ask them. So I cannot answer that question. Do we have to have an account in GitHub to look at the contents? Then no, Appium is a public repository, so you can, I don't think you need an account in GitHub. Is it possible to get app element style properties, for example, buttons or color, using the approach you just shared? So again, this depends on the underlying automation framework. I think that for XCUI, for example, since the way that XCUI works is by defining proxy objects, and these are kind of thin proxy objects. So I think you don't have the ability, even if you add code to Appium, you're limited to the APIs provided to you by XCUI. For Android, I don't know. We need to investigate that. But you know, it's a good question. You can check if UI Automator 2, or for example, if Espresso framework gives you that capability, then you can definitely add, similar to what we did, you can add a bridge which grabs in Appium, which grabs these specific values. Okay. Can the true viewport command be used for desktop Selenium website? Sorry, let me just see the question entirely. For website testing, or is it only Appium? Okay, so the true viewport command we've added is just for Appium, because this was missing in Appium. In web, you don't have status bar, for example. If you're talking about mobile, no, you're asking specific. Okay, you're asking specifically for desktop. So for desktop Selenium, you don't have status bar, so it doesn't matter. For mobile Selenium, for Safari, you need to remove that manually because it's not a native app, so Appium can't really remove that. Again, if you're using Applitools to test your screenshots, we do it for you automatically. We add this capability as part of our SDK. There's another question of what is Applitools exactly. So as I mentioned, Applitools is basically a visual validation service, an automatic visual validation service. What we do is automatic testing for screenshots. Our main, I would say, the core of the Applitools service is basically the AI that knows that basically can tell that two screenshots are similar in a manner that looks the same to a human eye, even though their pixels might be different under the hood. Image comparison, if you research a bit, is an extremely complex problem, and Applitools, I think, is probably the only one in the world today which can solve this problem in a manner that's maintainable. And the SDKs for Applitools enable you to grab screenshots, complex screenshots, which is the example I showed you now, screenshots which you would have otherwise difficulty to get from, for example, from a mobile device or from a frame inside a frame on Selenium desktop or something like that. Okay. There's other questions regarding Appium. Why did Appium deprecated some of its methods? Again, these are questions that should be pointed to the Appium team. I can tell you though that, like I said, UI automation is Apple has deprecated UI automation since Xcode 8. So Appium is probably just following their footsteps. They must use the underlying automation framework, and if Apple doesn't provide the APIs, then they cannot use them as well. Okay. I think, okay, how easy it is to add capabilities to Appium and how much time does it take? So this is, I think, would be the last question. The answer is it depends. We've added an extremely complex set of capabilities, and like I said, it took us like a gross of almost 1 year. But this was because it involved several types of research. One was actually understanding how Appium is built, and the other one was actually understanding how to add the capabilities. Even if we know Appium is built in some way, we still need to find a way to add these capabilities based on the automation framework. But if you already know what you want to add and you know how to add it based on the automation framework, and now you have an understanding of how Appium is built, then it can take you a lot less than it took us, for example. I think this is basically it. We'll try to answer additional questions offline. We have the questions recorded, so thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure. I hope this was informative. And that's it.
Okay, so I also want to thank Daniel for taking the time to do this live and in-depth presentation. And I just want to remind you that the link to the recording will be emailed to you on Monday because I saw quite a few questions about that as well. So thank you, and I hope to see you all at our next event.